All right, welcome to this explainer. Let's jump right in, shall we? Today we're unpacking a really chilling example of how tiny, seemingly minor human errors and systemic oversights can compound into just an absolute catastrophe. We're going to look at the exact sequence of events that brought down Air China Flight 129 back in April of 2002. Now, this isn't just a simple story about a plane crashing into a mountain. It's a deep, analytical look at the systemic breakdown of a flight crew who are operating right on the very edge of their margins. We're going to start right at the terrifying end. Just imagine being in that cockpit. It's heavily overcast, it's pouring rain, and visibility is plummeting fast. Suddenly, breaking through the dense cloud directly in front of the windshield, a literal mountain emerges. First Officer Gao screams, "Pull up." But sadly, at this exact second, the fate of 155 passengers and 11 crew members is already sealed. The sheer inertia of a massive Boeing 767 means that just hauling the nose up isn't going to cut it. So how did a modern airliner in perfectly good working order end up unknowingly flying headlong into a mountain just moments before landing? Let's break it all down.
Part 1. Setting the scene, April 15, 2002.
So Flight 129 pushes back from Beijing that morning in perfect working order. The plane was fueled up, the crew was fully rested, and the aircraft itself was in excellent mechanical shape. But if we look beneath the surface, a really dangerous dynamic was actually in play. On paper, the flight crew looks highly qualified, right? Thousands of hours under their belts. But critically, they lacked situational experience. Captain Wu had only been a captain for 4 months. First Officer Gao was on just his 3rd flight in his seat. And Second Officer Ho, he had literally never even been to Busan before. They had plenty of general experience, sure, but absolutely not the specific experience needed for where they were going. And that lack of familiarity is absolutely crucial here. Busan's Gimhae Airport is notoriously tough. It's bordered by the sea, surrounded by mountains to the north, and that creates these wildly unpredictable weather patterns, super low cloud ceilings, and tricky shifting winds. In fact, the Korean government had classified it as a special airport, which meant it required specific pilot qualifications. But somehow, Air China had completely missed this classification for Busan. They had places like San Francisco marked as special, but not here. So you have this relatively inexperienced, newly promoted crew being sent into a highly complex environment without the required specialized training. Part 2. A sudden change of plans as the weather deteriorates. Right in the middle of the flight, air traffic control drops some seriously unwelcome news. Busan's visibility was plummeting down to 2 miles with fog and rain, and the wind was blowing really strongly from the south. Now, originally, the crew planned an instrument landing system approach on runway 36 left. That's a super safe, electronically guided path straight down to the tarmac regardless of the clouds outside. But that strong tailwind, it forced them to switch to runway 18 right, landing in the exact opposite direction. This required a visual circle-to-land maneuver that strips away their electronic safety net entirely and forces them to rely only on what they can physically see out the window. Talk about a massive curveball. Part 3. The circle-to-land, a complex maneuver. This circle-to-land approach is basically an intense, precise geometric ballet in the sky. In the simulator, the textbook procedure is super strict. You descend to a minimum descent altitude of exactly 700 feet. You turn 45 degrees left, level out, and time exactly 20 seconds. Then you turn right to fly parallel to the runway going downwind. Finally, after you pass the runway threshold, you time another 20 seconds before making a really tight base turn to line up and land. But here's the kicker. Despite having almost no experience doing this at Busan, the crew completely glossed over their safety briefing. They just didn't review the steps, leaving themselves dangerously unprepared for what was coming. And all of that strict geometry, it exists to respect one absolutely critical number, a 1.7 nautical mile limit. During this entire circling maneuver, the aircraft has to stay within 1.7 miles of the runway. Why? Because outside of that invisible protective boundary, massive mountains are lurking right inside those clouds. If you stay inside the circle at 700 feet, you're perfectly safe. But the second you drift outside of it, you lose your terrain protection completely. Part 4. A chain of fatal errors driven by task saturation. Okay, so as they begin their descent, things just start to snowball. Their poor crew resource management and that skipped briefing meant they didn't have a shared mental picture of what was supposed to happen, and the challenges are stacking up fast. A 20-knot tailwind is pushing them way faster than they realize. The first officer's initial turn is far too shallow, which immediately throws off their spatial orientation in the clouds. Meanwhile, the second officer is struggling heavily with the language barrier and ends up missing multiple crucial radio calls from air traffic control. It's just a recipe for disaster. If we track the timeline here, it's wild how fast these errors pile up. At 11:17 a.m., they intercept the localizer and drop down to 700 feet. But that shallow turn we just talked about, it puts them just 1.1 nautical miles from the runway, which is way too tight. Plus, because they never brief their approach speeds, they fly the downwind leg at 160 knots instead of the required 140. Add in that massive tailwind, and they are suddenly hitting 180 knots over the ground. Seeing the first officer really struggling with the wind and the spacing, the captain just abruptly takes manual control of the plane. And this right here, this is where the point of no return is crossed. With the captain now flying manually from the left seat, he actually loses sight of the runway out the right window. Realizing they're way too close to the runway laterally, he decides to extend the downwind leg. Remember that 20-second timer from the textbook procedure? He lets it run for an excessive, fatal 40 seconds before he finally begins his turn. That delay, pushed by the fierce tailwind, literally rockets them out of the safe 1.7 nautical mile zone. They drift nearly 2.5 miles to the north, right into the mountains. So now they're deep in the turn, flying completely blind inside the clouds. The captain asks the first officer to help him find the airport, but the first officer just replies, "I can't see the runway." The truly heart-stopping failure here is that he had actually lost sight of it moments earlier and said absolutely nothing. In a visual circling approach, the absolute cardinal rule is this: if you lose sight of the runway, you immediately call for a mandatory go-around. No questions asked. You apply full power and climb out. But nobody called it. The captain just kept turning in the clouds. Now, you might be wondering, why didn't the plane itself warn them? I mean, the aircraft was equipped with a ground proximity warning system, or GPWS. It uses a radio altimeter to sense the ground directly below the plane. However, because the crew already had their landing gear and flaps fully extended for the approach, the system simply assumed they were landing safely on a runway. It was an older piece of tech that couldn't actually look ahead of the flight path. So as the mountain rose up to meet them, the alarm stayed deadly silent. Which brings us right back to those horrifying final seconds. Less than 5 seconds after the first officer finally suggests a go-around, Mount Dotai emerges from the fog. The captain violently hauls back on the yoke. The nose pitches up, but it's just too little, too late. The massive Boeing 767 slams into the hillside, and the truly heartbreaking detail here, they were just 50 feet too low. Had they been literally 50 feet higher, they would have completely cleared the summit.
Part 5. Aftermath and Safety Reforms, a Changed Industry. The impact, of course, destroyed the aircraft instantly. Impartially looking at the data, the human toll was just staggering. Out of the 166 passengers and crew on board, only 37 survived, which miraculously included the captain. It cemented itself, at the time, as South Korea's worst ever aviation disaster, and it forced a massive, industry-wide reckoning regarding pilot training and terrain awareness. Now, to address these specific systemic failures, Air China implemented some really concrete and highly effective reforms. They totally overhauled their circle-to-land simulator training, focusing strictly on speed and radius adherence. They also shifted crew resource management training from boring theory to real-life scenario stress testing. But most importantly, they upgraded their fleets to the enhanced ground proximity warning system. This new system uses a GPS terrain database to actually look ahead of the plane, an upgrade that absolutely would have prevented this crash. Oh, and Busan was finally properly designated as a special airport. Because of these strict reforms, Air China has had 0 fatal crashes since. I kind of want to leave you with this final thought today. When you step onto a commercial airliner right now, you're stepping into a machine governed by rules written in the wake of tragedies exactly like Flight 129. The rigorous briefings, the enhanced software looking ahead, the strict communication protocols, none of this is just boring bureaucracy. It's a direct evolution born from human error. So how much of our modern